Some of that. So before we begin, here's some quick statistics about the Battle of the Somme itself. Okay, I'm not going to read everything out, but the numbers are pretty staggering. But the key one that I want you to focus on right now are these 2 points here. Okay, so 72,000 missing on the Somme alone. Okay, I mean that's just Commonwealth casualties. We're not talking the Germans. We're not talking the French. That's just British, Canadian, Kiwis, Aussies, in general. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to discuss with you before we kind of rolled into things is, how you doing, Paul?
Good. How are you, Steve?
I'm good. So one of the things I wanted to briefly show you is the situation that the soldiers were dealing with at the time of the war, i.e. the burials, actually at that time. So here's one particular Canadian soldier getting buried on the Somme. You notice the spoil here. So chalk, pretty heavy. I mean, the conditions of the Somme itself are pretty horrendous just to try and bury folks on there. And you'll notice as well, something has gone awry with this burial, because here his feet are in this one position, and in the next photo he's facing the other way and he's hanging out of his blanket. So that's basically what happened to soldiers when they were killed on the Western Front. They were wrapped basically in their blanket and buried. Okay. That's the short end of it. And afterwards, they actually had creosote soaked blankets that the remains would go in, and they would be buried that way as well. So one of the things I wanted to draw your attention to as well is how many have actually toured the Western Front areas? So a few folks, okay? So one of the things you come to notice very quickly are, if you're driving around in that region of France, the cemeteries, you'll see a big one, you can see small ones, and just the location of the cemetery tells a story, okay? And this is kind of what's going on here. Now, just for fun, anybody kind of have any idea where this might be, or what's going on, or just for fun? It's really hard to see some of the stuff that's going on here, but this is a hospital cemetery, okay? And you guys can't really see, but the guys are wearing the Red Cross armbands. So these guys are medics, and as a guy passed away into the hospital, basically out of the back door of the hospital and buried. And you can see it's really nice and orderly, okay? Because they don't have to worry about getting shelled or anything else like that. So that in itself is established. When you're driving in France, you're looking around and say, oh, okay, well, you can kind of get a sense of what kind of cemetery you're looking at just from the location and how it's arranged. As opposed to that is directly on the battlefield. And this is the padre here giving basically last rites to a victim buried in the mud. So now you see the difference as to how some of these soldiers and how they became to get buried. Sometimes there's just a hasty burial. There's not enough time to, shooting going on, quickly covered and left. Okay. Now, just as an aside, I mean, the recovery of remains on the Western Front continues today. Every year, they're finding additional folks. But the recovery of remains en masse was going right up into the 1930s. So this is post-war. Now everything's nice and pretty. And you can see this is a battlefield cemetery, small, isolated, cut into the middle of a farmer's field. Okay, and the guy does his crops all the way around the cemetery, he does his business. Whereas this one here, large, that's Caterpillar Valley Cemetery. That's where the 2 airmen I located are buried. Nice, clean, but this was also known as a collector cemetery. So after the war, a lot of these temporary cemeteries that have been established around the field posts and everything else like that, all of the bodies were exhumed and they were brought into these larger cemeteries. Now this particular cemetery alone, 75% of what you see there are unknowns. That's just one. I mean, there's a lot more of those types of cemeteries. So, anyway, as Cal alluded to earlier, I was going around a lot of these cemeteries in France, and I was looking for just details on the headstone that I thought, can this guy be identified or not? Because the whole plan was to send the information back to Canada and let guys, girls, whatever, anybody who wanted to do some research could potentially collectively add to that particular story, and maybe we find somebody. So my wife and I would go to these cemeteries, and I had 2 little boys at the time. So guess what? Little kids love to run around, and perfect. And I would tell them, you go find me the maple leaves. So they would run around and say, Dad, here's a Canadian soldier. Yeah, good, awesome, So it kept them occupied. So one night, we were not far from where this cemetery was, and we stopped in, and the sun is going down, and I'm rushing around. I'm running through these rows, just trying to find. And all I'm looking for is what I call low-hanging fruit, i.e., an unknown corporal, an unknown sergeant of a specific battalion, or an unknown officer of a specific battalion. Because generally speaking, when they're greater, the greater the rank, the more that is written about them in the histories, which I call low-hanging fruit. I stumbled across these 2 headstones. So you can't, I'm sorry about the image, but it says a British airman, observer of the Great War, British airman, pilot of the Great War. Now, knowing what I know about Commonwealth cemeteries, any air crews that were shot down are generally buried together. If the airplane crashed, and then the bodies were recovered, they are generally side by side, okay? That doesn't happen in all circumstances, but my immediate thought was these 2 were a tandem crew. So I kind of went, So I go back to where I'm staying, and the War Graves Commission has a wonderful website that is very robust when it comes to trying to locate missing soldiers, okay? So I wanted to do a search, so I went to their website here, I plugged in the Caterpillar Valley Cemetery, and then when I asked it, I just said, okay, tell me what you know about it, and it spits out an Excel spreadsheet for me as an output. Great. So, the paperwork that would accompany after the war, like when the War Graves Commission was establishing, the final resting places, it was very methodical for them how they were doing all the paperwork. So they had these documents. So this one's called the Graves Registration Report Form. Now this is kind of like the last of the paperwork, okay? That is the final disposition of who is in a particular cemetery, what plot, and what grave, etc. So when I came back, and all of this information is online, one thing I noticed very quickly here is we got the unknown British airman, okay, the observer, and an unknown British airman and the pilot in the respective rows and plots that you saw. But in both cases, they had the initials of MC written after them, and MC means military cross. These guys were decorated, okay? So very common for officers to be awarded the MC, particularly airmen. So this kind of, I mean, how many guys were flying together that both had the military cross? So it turns out, during the whole entire First World War, there were only 4. So now I know it's either somebody in this airplane or it's somebody else in this other airplane. It's one of two. So we gotta, how do we figure this out? So here's some basic assumptions I started with, you know, to get the ball rolling. Well, since they both have the MC, they're Army, okay? And why I say they're Army is because the Royal Air Force doesn't start till 1918, okay? So the pedigree of these guys that are buried is probably Royal Flying Corps, okay? Where they were located and where they're buried indicated to me that they were probably casualties of the Somme offensive in 1916. These 2 guys were unknown airmen, so therefore they're going to be listed on the Arras Flying Services Memorial, for which there were 1,000 names on that memorial. So missing airmen. And then again, as I pointed out already, since these 2 were side by side, then there's probably, you know, a fairly decent chance they belonged to the same airplane when they went down. So those are just the assumptions that I'm going to massage and work and see how I can bring that together. So now I have to refine the assumptions. I needed to know if they had to be from the same squadron. So you can't have one guy from number 6 squadron and a number 8 squadron being in the same airplane. They didn't do that. Okay? So when I'm going to conduct my search, I need to find the information that would pertain to they're from the same squadron, they're killed on the same day, part of the same aircraft, and they had to have earned the military cross. So how do I do that? Well, it turns out I can go back to the Commonwealth War Graves database, and I can say, please tell me about all of the airmen who were killed and are listed on the Arras Flying Services Memorial. So I did that. And this is kind of a couple of screenshots. So what I did is I actually searched, I did a search for every year. Okay, so from 1914 to 1919, and I separated them. Okay? So for each of these years, and then it became apparent when I started looking at the information that I came down to those 2 aircrews. But there are only 2 aircrews along the way. Awesome. How and where are these other guys, and where do they fit into the picture? So now I know that Lieutenant Kidd and Second Lieutenant Phillips, Captain Coven and Captain Thayer are the 4 candidates that can fit those 2 headstones that I showed you earlier. Okay? But now I know who they are, but now I have to prove, like I'm almost certain now that it's Kidd and Phillips. That's where things were going, and you know, I zeroed in on that. But because the War Graves Commission, when you submit a case, it has to be extremely tight and locked. So I have to get all of the information nice, square, packaged, and delivered properly. So the Royal Air Force has a museum just outside of London, at RAF Hendon, and there they have this collection of casualty cards to all members of the Royal Flying Corps and RAF that were lost during the First World War. It's all online, and it's a fantastic resource when you're talking military airmen. So what these cards told me is, again, there's different information here. So Coven and Thayer, I've got the crew of the 1 airplane, And then I've got Kidd and Phillips and the crew of the second potential. So it tells me when it happened, the date of casualty, where it happened, the type of airplane they were flying, the nature of the accident, result, and what happened. Now, one of the things I thought was really cool when I'm doing this research was notification of Thayer and Cubbon was given to the British by the Germans themselves. German airplane flew over the airfield, dropped a note and said, by the way, sorry, your guys are gone. They were shot down and we buried them. And you see this coming across in the notations on several files where the Germans are actually telling the British, here's where your guys are. So, again, you see MC, the military cross, military cross, military cross. Now, his wasn't marked, but he had the MC as well. But this was important because of the tidbits of information. So now I know that these guys are killed north, near the French-Belgian border, whereas these guys killed near the lines, near, well, they say France, but the aircraft is there as well. But basically, they're telling me some key information that will come pertinent later. Okay, especially this part where it says machine fell near the lines. Okay. So now, just quickly plotting where these guys were lost. So you've got Cubbon and Thayer north, and then you've got Kidd and Phillips down here, down on the Somme. So, I mean, I think you would agree with me that the likelihood of Cubbon and Thayer being in those two graves was kind of remote, based on the location. And despite the fact that they were flying an airplane, even the airplanes of that day didn't necessarily have that kind of a range. So even if they had been shot down or they started to glide down to the ground, there's no way they were going to go 75 miles. Okay, so for me, the logic was those two graves definitely belong to Kidd and Phillips. But again, I still got to prove it. Now, the background here is a trench map of the Somme. This is a report that the commanding officer drafted when Kidd and Phillips were killed. Up here, this is all of the reporting that Kidd and Phillips themselves reported. So after every flight, Phillips would jump out of his aircraft, he would draft his notes, and he would submit that report. Okay? I'm talking, talking about planets lining up. The fact that this particular squadron's war diaries still exist, to me was, I don't know how to describe it. I just luck that they existed and we were able to see what was going on. But basically, from October 6th to October 11th, the day before they died, they're flying in this particular pattern around here for these trenches, and they're watching what the Germans are up to. Okay? So that's what Phillips himself is telling us in here. Now, this little blurb down here is written by their squadron mates. So after Kidd and Phillips got shot down, the next day, an air crew goes up and they go to try and find them. Where did they go? And in this note down here, they talk about finding, they see the wreckage of the aircraft, they know that there's a battalion headquarters right around, right where they went down. And, just the pointing out of where things are coming down was really interesting. So, this report, so marking A, basically gave me an initial grid reference here to tell me, well, they thought they were at this point. Section B was this one here, this note, location of the battalion headquarters for a British battalion that was in the vicinity during the battle. Now this red arrow, this was the Gotcha. This was the smoking gun. So this document here is called the burial return, and this is one of the other documents that was used by the War Graves Commission to figure out who came from where and how they arrived at their particular plot. So this little notation gave me the grid reference. Okay, so the grid reference for these two airmen is basically where on the end of that red arrow. Okay, and in here it says they were recovered. The bodies were recovered in 1921. It says they were buried together, and they were both airmen identified by their badges. Okay, but the key point for that document was the fact that they were buried together. Okay? That was critical because what that did was when I drafted my report to the War Graves Commission, it essentially closed the hole so that the War Graves Commission couldn't come back and say, well, that could have been that pilot from that squadron that just happened to be buried there that day, and it happened to be that observer that was recovered 2 years later and buried there. These guys came from the same place at the same time. They're the crew of that particular airplane. So here's the document itself. Again, and they note, again, observer, the pilot with the military cross, Air Force uniform and badges being in one grade. So in this particular scenario, I now know that these guys were likely buried by the British because they fell behind the lines. They got lucky. Hasty burial, and fortunately what I think happened, and this is conjecture on my part, but given the fact that they were air crew and they were wearing heavy leathers, okay, the fact they were buried in their leathers preserved their uniforms underneath, so the ribbon of the MC was preserved. So thankfully they were wearing what they were wearing, which helped this case almost 100 years later. So, got her solved, right? Nope. Nope, not even close. Okay, so here's the problem. I know both of these airmen have been awarded the Military Cross. The only problem is, so one is gazetted, as you see with Phillips, October 20th, and then Lieutenant Kidd is gazetted November 14th. Anybody see a problem with that? Well, they're dead October 12th. So I'm like, oh, okay, well that's a problem. So, I naively believed that there would be lots of information associated with the Military Cross. Well, it turns out there isn't, especially the early days of the Military Cross and how it was founded. Now, I got to go, I worked in the Ministry of Defence building in London, and I had access to the Army Historical Section for the British Army. And man, do I tell you, like, I had some people that were rooting for me because they were like, okay, Steve, you should probably look in these folders in the National Archives. So I was able to go in there and have a grand old chat with these guys and pick their brains, and they were just pointing me in the right areas. Anyway, so now everybody knew one particular thing about the Military Cross, and the way it worked is it could be instantly awarded, meaning the general officer commanding in the field had the ability to say, yep, you've been awarded the Military Cross, signed it off. You can put the ribbon on now, but you have to wait until you go on leave to London and you pick it up from the king himself. That's the way it worked. But they were entitled to wear the ribbon, and it was some degree of recognition because a lot of these guys were dying before they even got to see the king. So it was well known within the collectors community that, oh yeah, the guy got the MC, well, they just got the ribbon and then picked it up later, okay? So that was well known, but I couldn't find any reference to that. Because again, I'm looking to close and tighten up the case, with the War Graves Commission. I don't want them coming back against my case by saying, well, prove that. So it actually came down, I'm going through this one file in the National Archives in London, and here's this notation written by the Assistant Military Secretary to another one that somebody was asking basically what I'm discussing. So are you telling me these guys get the medals in the field and then they get them later from the king? And this is what the guy responds. He says, no decorations or medals are sent into the field, but the individual is entitled to wear the ribbon as soon as the award is made and is not required to await the presentation of the insignia by the king. So I'm like, awesome. So I'm, you know, tapping away and writing away. That was great. But there are steps to the awarding of the Military Cross. So how does that work? Well, first the deed, you have to write about it. So somebody had to compile what did somebody do to earn the medal. So that's step one. Then it has to be recommended by the commanding officer to, his next step in the chain of command. Then it has to be considered by the upper echelon. Then it has to be promulgated to say, yep, this guy earned it, and this is when he can wear it. And then the London Gazette would publish it later on, and then the guy gets to go at Buckingham Palace, king shakes his hand and pins the medal on his chest, kind of thing, right? So, fortunately, again, planets lining up, the records existed for the 4th Army for this particular squadron. And in this, so, again, you can't really read the writing here, but these two documents are the awards for both Kidd and Phillips. And basically, it's an instant reward. So now, the Army has said, you're good to go. But that has to trickle down from upper headquarters down to the squadron level, meeting that promulgation and the local stuff. So here's the local promulgation for the wing orders. So on September 17th, Phillips is allowed to put up the ribbon of the MC. And it was Kidd that really worried me. He gets the local promulgation for October 10th, and he dies October 12th. So I was wondering, when does this guy get his medal? Because Kidd was the one that was causing me the most grief. Because if it occurred after the 12th, then that essentially threw out the entire case. I wouldn't have been able to submit it. Okay? Now, of interest, one of the other guys that was flying in this squadron, this is a little sidebar. Anybody not familiar with the little broadcasting corporation known as the BBC? Okay, so one of their compatriots, Cecil Lewis, who wrote an outstanding book about air warfare in the First World War. It's called Sagittarius Rising. Cecil Lewis is one of the founders of the BBC. And he and Phillips were actually the tandem crew, but Cecil Lewis went on leave to England, and Kidd jumped into the cockpit and was doing the flying while Lewis was gone. And I actually did uncover an interview of Cecil Lewis talking about the loss of Second Lieutenant Phillips, and it was a devastating blow to Cecil Lewis. I mean, when you see the emotion on this guy's face, it's very, it's poignant when you see him talking about the loss of his friend. Anyway, getting back to this case though, now we have, I've got everything has been set up, so now it is, I mean, for me, this was closing it up. Now I'm closing the end of the loop here to submit my case. But I always had in the back of my head, geez, when did Kidd get his award? I know it's somewhere between, obviously before October 12th, and maybe, somewhere around the 9th, or anyway. Kidd himself tells us when. And I say that because Kidd, Lieutenant Kidd, belonged to the Bromsgrove School. So it's, like a private school for boys, well-to-do families. Kidd comes from a family of doctors. So they got some money, and he was sent off to this school. And it turns out this school has a archive. And after the war, they compiled a lot of letters and stuff that people had written during the war, in memoriam of lost classmates. So it turns out Kidd himself wrote a letter to his father on October 10th. It said, "Chiro, I got my military cross today, thank goodness. I did want something to show for the Somme job." So Kidd himself tells us when and what day he was awarded the MC. Now, again, freak, planets aligning. A good friend of mine who ran a battlefield tour company in Belgium went to the Bromsgrove School as a kid. And he's sitting there, he goes, "Steve, what was the name of that guy that you're investigating?" Yeah, I said, "Oh, well, Kidd and Phillips." He goes, "Kidd, yeah, he went to my school." So he was the one that put me in touch with the school archivist, and she provided me with that piece of information there. So all of this information is just kind of coming from disparate locations and then lining up, which I thought was awesome. So that case I researched for probably 2 months in 2015. 25 pages later, writing the arguments and putting it all together and what I had found and located, the War Graves Commission notified me of their acceptance of the case in 2017. So it almost took 2 years for them to adjudicate the case. So the War Graves Commission, it looked at it, went, "Yeah, we're happy with this," but then it has to go to the Joint Casualty and Compassion Center within the UK Ministry of Defence, and they review the case, because unlike Canada, Veterans Affairs, if a Canadian soldier is located, Veterans Affairs will say, "Yep, we're happy with that, sign the paperwork off, pay for the headstone." Our Department of National Defence doesn't do that, okay? It's Veterans Affairs that does it, but in the UK, it's still controlled by the British Armed Forces under the UK Ministry of Defence. Anyway, they agreed, and so here I am in France. This was October 12th, 2017, so 101 years exactly to the day. We had a ceremony for them, and their headstones were annotated properly with their names and their units, and that, I was informed, was the first rededication of a Royal Flying Corps headstone in almost 100 years. So I thought that was awesome. So I just kind of want to introduce you to some of the families. So this is the great niece and great nephew of the observer, Leonard Kidd. Now, what's interesting to note about Kidd was a musician. And it was apparently very well respected by the members of his squadron, because when he passed away, there was a lot of talk about how they missed having this guy around. So, and not only is he an artist, but he's also a musician. Well, she's an artist and musician. Which I thought, wow, what a coincidence, right? And then this is the family of the pilot, Lieutenant Kidd. So Graham Kidd was the closest living relative, and he was the first cousin once removed of Leonard Kidd. He's an retired Army doctor. And oddly enough, this is Julian Kidd and his wife Jenny. He's a first cousin once removed as well. He was a pilot in the Royal Air Force. So I'm just kind of finding it interesting that even though, these two guys have been gone for 100 years, their family still had some of those traits that these missing airmen had. I just thought it was unique. Anyway, sorry. So this guy is named Charles Ashton. He's a high-end Fleet Street lawyer, and his passion is collecting metals. And why that's of interest to me is because when I started my research, I came across the internet the sale of Lieutenant Phillips medals. And the reason I was so interested in metals, because part of the description of the sale said, this grouping of medals will also come with photographs. I went, oh, you know, like, so I got in touch with the metal company that sold the medals about 3 years prior, and I said, could you please put me in touch with the purchaser of the medals? And fired it out, and I didn't hear anything for the longest time. And then one day I get this email out of the blue from Charles Ashton saying, yeah, I still have them, and I still have the photos. And I said, would you mind scanning them and sending them? Because I'd really like to look. Because what I was hoping to find was a photo of one of them getting awarded the Military Cross. Now that didn't pan out, but nevertheless, cool photos nonetheless. But here I am at the grave of Lieutenant Phillips, holding his medals and the cap badges that he actually wore. I thought that was pretty neat. With that in mind, because of the photos that Charles had, that is the exact airplane that was shot down October 12th, 1916, tail number 5178, and it's a Marine Parasol. They didn't use these much longer after 1916, and basically their role was to fly around doing what's called a contact patrol. They would fly approximately 1,000 feet above the ground, so Phillips would have been in the back, and he would have had the ability to signal via telegraph, and Kidd would be in the front, and anyway, that's what they were flying when they were killed. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Lieutenant Kidd, the pilot, on the left, and there's Second Lieutenant Phillips on the right. There they are.
How old were they?
We're talking early 20s.
Just a kid.
Yeah, now this guy here, now Kidd, he went to Ceylon and was working in I think it was a tea plantation. And when the war broke out, he came back and went into the Royal Flying Corps, because this photo of him is actually his pilot's license photograph for 1913. Now what makes these guys so special is that they are essentially Royal Air Force royalty, because they are one of the first squadrons to ever deploy in a military capacity for the British Armed Forces. We got another photo here. Here they are again. So you can see Kidd in the middle, distinctive because of his, you know, his, what do they call this, the forehead. Yeah. There he is in the cockpit, and there's Phillips sitting there in the crew. So nice and cozy. But you can see what I'm talking about. Maybe there's another photo here. Oh, I thought I had a photo of Phillips in his leathers. But you can see, again, the heavy stuff, the heavy clothing they're wearing, the leathers, which is, again, why I was going back to, you know, because they were wearing that stuff, it was likely that preserved them.